forgotten architects of civilization who shaped our world more than history remembers. From nomadic tribes roaming the Syrian steppe to founders of powerful kingdoms like Damascus, the Arameans emerged during the Bronze Age collapse to fill the power vacuum left by crumbling empires. Though conquered by Assyria, their language became the diplomatic bridge between cultures, spreading across 3 continents as the lingua franca of ancient commerce. Even as kingdoms fell, Aramaic endured, spoken by Jesus, preserved in Syriac Christianity, and surviving even today in remote mountain villages. Discover how a desert people's resilience transformed defeat into lasting cultural victory. Smoke lingers over broken cities, drifting like a funeral shroud across the Near Eastern sky. Walls once thought eternal lie toppled in heaps of stone, their gates splintered, their temples silent but for the hiss of wind through shattered columns. It is the 12th century before Christ, and the world of the late Bronze Age is collapsing. Great powers that ruled with iron hands, Hittite kings, Egyptian pharaohs, Mycenaean warlords, watch their realms fracture under the weight of famine, war, and migration. Where armies once marched in orderly ranks, bands of raiders now descend like locusts. Merchants who guided caravans across the Fertile Crescent return to find marketplaces abandoned, cities blackened, and roads unsafe. The collapse of kingdoms leaves behind a vast vacuum, and into that void, steppe peoples, whose names had never before echoed beyond the steppe. Among them are tribes known by a new and haunting word, Aramu. Far from the fertile valleys of the Nile or the Tigris, in the windswept plains of the Syrian steppe, tents of goat hair rise against the horizon. Campfires flicker where night presses in, and herders move among their flocks beneath constellations that have guided their ancestors since time beyond memory. These nomads, speakers of a tongue kin to Hebrew and Phoenician, roam with little more than what camels and donkeys can carry. They are Semites, hardened by arid lands where survival depends on movement, memory, and trust within the clan. Though small in number, their presence begins to leave marks in the records of neighbors. Scribes in Assyria, far to the east, scratch clay tablets with cuneiform signs naming strange marauders at their borders. Alame Aramu, Aramean bands. To the administrators of mighty cities, these intruders seem pests, little more than dust storms sweeping in from the desert. Yet these wanderers will endure long after the kings who cursed them have turned to ash. Their language binds them together. Aramaic, in its earliest form, flows with the cadence of kinship and oath. It shares roots with tongues already ancient. Akkadian in Mesopotamia, Hebrew in Canaan, Ugaritic along the Levantine coast. But unlike the complexity of scribal Akkadian or the ritual precision of Egyptian hieroglyphs, this speech is pliable, born of oral tradition and carried easily on the lips of shepherds and traders. Around campfires, it shapes songs of ancestry. In market stalls, it haggles over goats and barley. In parley with foreign kings, it proves clear enough to cut through misunderstanding. A language carried on the wind becomes a thread that will one day stitch together half the known world. At first, the Arameans appear as shadows moving across contested lands. One band grazes sheep in Upper Mesopotamia, another drifts toward the Orontes Valley, still others slip between Assyrian fortresses along the Kabur. They are not an empire, nor even a people united under a single banner, but tribes, each guided by its chieftain, each answering to the rhythms of pasture and season. The Assyrians call them Bit Zamani, Bit Adini, Bit Bahiani, house of this or that patriarch. To outsiders, these are indistinct clusters of tents. To those within, They are lineages stretching back through generations, tied by blood and oath. This was an age when the settled and the nomadic eyed each other with equal suspicion. Farmers who carved irrigation canals through the Euphrates plain cursed the herds that trampled their fields. Caravan merchants, however, found advantage in these wanderers, who knew desert trails better than any map and could guide goods safely between ruined cities. In times of war, Aramean horsemen were both feared raiders and sought-after mercenaries. The very instability of the age made them indispensable, even as it made them dangerous. Legends whisper that their earliest chiefs were men who could command not only warriors, but also the loyalty of far-flung kin. Around their tents gathered those weary of famine, displaced by war, or fleeing broken thrones. With every new season, bands swelled into tribes, tribes into loose federations. Slowly, imperceptibly, the Arameans ceased to be wanderers skirting the edges of history and began carving out spaces of permanence. Across the Euphrates, on hills rising above fertile plains, fires no longer burn only in temporary camps. Timber palisades rise where once stood only herders' pens. Stone foundations appear beneath huts, and granaries hold the grain of barley fields cut into valleys, once grazed by goats alone. Villages sprout like spring shoots after rain, fragile yet persistent. To the scribes of Nineveh and Asher, these places are vexing, settlements that cannot be destroyed by a single raid, houses that cannot simply be burned and forgotten. Yet the transformation was not only physical. Rituals once performed beneath open sky find new homes in shrines of stone. Spirits of desert and mountain are invoked now within walls marked by carved altars. The gods they worship, Hadad of the storm, Atargatis the great lady, become protectors of communities as much as of clans. A nomadic faith begins to entwine with the rooted permanence of cities. Still, the memory of wandering lingers in their ways. Even as some settle, others continue to drift, pressing into lands weakened by collapse. The fall of the Hittite Empire to the northwest leaves behind fractured states, each vulnerable to intrusion. Into these gaps flow Aramean families, sometimes welcomed as allies, often resisted as intruders. On the frontiers of Canaan, brush shoulders with Israelites and Phoenicians. Along the Euphrates, they trade and clash with remnants of Hurrian and Assyrian strongholds. One scene, preserved in Assyrian annals, speaks volumes. A king of Asher orders his scribes to record a campaign against Aramu tribes that had plundered borderlands. He boasts of burning their tents, seizing their herds, scattering them across the steppe. Yet within a generation, those same tribes return, larger and bolder than before. The very fluidity of nomadic life makes them impossible to destroy. Like water poured upon the earth, they seep back, filling every crack left by crumbling empires. By the close of the 11th century before Christ, the Arameans are no longer simply wanderers, haunting the edge of settled lands. They are neighbors, rivals, sometimes overlords. Their speech, once confined to fireside tales, carries across markets and treaties. Their names, once dismissed as minor annoyances, become markers of power. The dawn of their story lies not in a single founding moment, but in this long twilight collapse, an age when the ruins of the old gave birth to the resilience of the new. The desert wind still whips across their encampments, and flocks still graze under watchful eyes. But in valleys carved by ancient rivers, the first outlines of towns rise. The nomads who once lived only by movement begin to write permanence upon the land. And as stone replaces tent, as lineage grows into kingdom, the world will learn that the people called Arameans have stepped onto the stage of history, never again to fade into obscurity. War horns cut through the air above the Euphrates, their echoes bouncing off bluffs that once sheltered only tents and grazing flocks. Now, men in leather armor stand on fresh-built ramparts, their spears lifted in defiance while banners ripple with the names of their houses. To neighbors who had long cursed the Arameans as little more than nomads and raiders, the sight was unsettling. A new chapter had begun. The tribes of the Syrian steppe were no longer wanderers. They were kings. Across the valleys of Syria and northern Mesopotamia, the change was unmistakable. Villages hardened into fortresses. Forts grew into towns, and towns became seats of power. Inscriptions that once dismissed the Arameans as pests now spoke of them as rulers. Each kingdom called itself a bit, the house of a patriarch, a clan transformed into a polity. Bit Adini, Bit Zamani, Bit Halupe, Bit Bahiani, names that tied bloodline to territory, loyalty to land. For the first time, Aramean chiefs ruled not only over herds and tents, but over stone walls, canals, and fertile fields. Among these new houses, Bit Adini commanded perhaps the most strategic ground. Its capital at Tilbarsip overlooked a bend of the Euphrates, where caravans forded the river and boats unloaded their cargo. Whoever held the citadel could tax the flow of goods between Anatolia and Mesopotamia. The kings of Bit Adini understood this, and they built accordingly. Walls layered with mud brick and timber, gates reinforced with bronze, temples dedicated to Hadad, whose storms were believed to guard their fortunes. To merchants, the kingdom was a toll to be paid. To Assyrians, a thorn lodged in their western frontier. Further east, Bit Zamani stood between the fertile Tigris plain and the mountain highlands. Its rulers kept one eye on Assyrian armies, another on the hill tribes that raided from the north. Life there demanded vigilance. Fields were terraced into stony slopes, fortresses crowned every hill, and warbands drilled with the speed of men who knew they could not match their neighbors in sheer numbers. What they lacked in wealth, they made up in resilience, adapting their nomadic toughness to the demands of defending a settled domain. Smaller houses filled the map like sparks from a fire. Bit Halupe watched the Kaba Valley. Bit Bahiani nestled near the Balik River. Countless others rose and fell in the turmoil of the age. None grew large enough to dominate the others, but together they reshaped the political landscape of Syria and Mesopotamia. The Arameans were no longer background raiders in the Chronicles of Kings. They had carved out seats at the table of power, and in the south, one city rose above all: Damascus. Its location in the Ghouta plain, watered by the Barada River, gave it an advantage few could rival. Orchards of fig and pomegranate stretched across the land, while grain fields rippled in the wind like sheets of gold. Caravans from Arabia converged here, bringing incense, spices, and camels laden with salt. Farmers from the anti-Lebanon highlands descended with wool and timber. Traders from the Phoenician coast arrived with purple dye and fine glassware. The city became a hub where wealth pooled as naturally as water in an oasis. Damascus also became a fortress. Its walls guarded the plain, and its rulers organized cavalry that could strike across deserts or into mountain passes with equal speed. Already in these early centuries, the city's reputation spread. To Israelites in the south, Damascus was a rival whose raids tested their young kingdoms. To Neo-Hittite princes in the north, it was both ally and competitor. To Assyrian monarchs, it was a prize worth seizing, but never easily held. The Arameans were never a single people bound under one crown. Each house followed its own lord, made its own treaties, fought its own wars. Yet their shared language, customs, and gods gave them a sense of kinship, one that made outsiders see them as a single force. Assyrian kings might burn one Aramean city to ash, only to find 3 more had risen elsewhere. Like fire in dry grass, they spread across Syria and Mesopotamia faster than any empire could contain. Conflict with neighbors shaped their destiny from the start. In the north, Aramean kingdoms pressed against Neo-Hittite strongholds, capturing villages, trading blows with princes who traced their lineage to the fallen Hittite Empire. To the west, their horsemen raided into Israelite lands, sparking feuds that would later echo in biblical stories of battles between Aram and Israel. And looming always to the east was Assyria, the great predator of Mesopotamia. From Ashur and Nineveh came armies determined to crush these upstart houses. Yet again and again, the Arameans endured. Fortresses might fall, kings might be slain, but the people scattered and regrouped, returning to rebuild. Trade was as vital as war. Caravans moved through Aramean lands, laden with copper from Cyprus, cedar from Lebanon, tin from Anatolia, and lapis from beyond the Zagros. Kingdoms taxed the flow of goods, growing rich enough to hire scribes and artisans, to decorate palaces with frescoes, to commission statues of their gods. Markets rang with the clamor of tongues. Phoenician sailors, Israelite traders, Aramean merchants, all haggling in Aramaic, a speech already spreading beyond its homeland for its clarity and ease. This blend of commerce and conflict forged the Arameans' identity. They had been wanderers, scorned as raiders. Now they were rulers, both feared and courted. Their horsemen could terrorize the countryside one season and escort caravans the next. Their kings could plunder a neighbor one year and seal a marriage alliance the following year. Flexibility was their strength, and it allowed their kingdoms to endure, despite constant pressure from larger powers. Syria and Mesopotamia in the 10th century before Christ stood shaped by their influence. The Euphrates Valley bristled with Aramean fortresses. The Kaaba Plain echoed with their war drums. Damascus stood as a beacon of wealth and ambition, poised to become the leading power of the Levant. The scattered tribes of the steppe had transformed into kingdoms whose influence would ripple across centuries. The age of raiding tents was gone. The age of Aramean kings had arrived. Bronze trumpets blared from the walls of Damascus as horsemen thundered through the gates, their spears tipped with fresh blood. Dust swirled across the Ghouta plain, carrying the smell of sweat, iron, and victory. In the courtyards, women and children lifted cries of triumph, while priests of Hadad splashed wine upon the altars, thanking the storm god for another conquest. This was no longer a city of mere survival. Damascus had become the beating heart of Aram, and its kings now reached beyond their own plain to command the destiny of the Levant. The rise began under Ben-Hadad I, remembered in later records as a king who transformed a fortified town into the core of a regional power. By the early 9th century before Christ, Damascus had subdued rival clans and extended authority over villages across southern Syria. Its orchards and fields yielded grain and fruit enough to sustain armies, while its markets grew fat on the wealth of caravans moving between Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean. To the smaller houses of Aram, Damascus became overlord. To Israel and Judah to the south, it became a dangerous rival. Conflict was inevitable. The Hebrew scriptures recall clashes between Damascus and Israel, stories of sieges and raids that left deep scars in memory. In these wars, Damascus proved its strength. Well-trained cavalry, chariots rolling across the plains, infantry hardened by constant campaigning. Its kings were not content with defense alone. They pressed southward, seeking influence over Canaanite trade and Israelite strongholds. Border towns changed hands more than once, each victory or defeat marking the balance of power in the region. When Ben-Hadad II inherited the throne, Damascus stood at its height. He ruled not as a tribal chief, but as a monarch commanding a state, and his ambitions stretched further than his father's. Israelite kings learned quickly that this ruler could demand tribute and enforce obedience with the edge of a spear. Chronicles describe tense confrontations, sieges around Samaria, battles for control of highland passes, truces brokered and broken in swift succession. For years, the fortunes of Israel rose and fell with the strength of Damascus. But Damascus did not stand alone. Across the Levant, kingdoms felt the pull of its influence. Smaller Aramean states looked to Ben-Hadad as leader of their cause. Even Phoenician ports, masters of the sea, weighed alliances with Damascus to protect their trade from Assyrian designs. For in the east, beyond the rivers, a far greater power stirred. The Assyrian Empire, long a looming shadow, now pressed westward under kings determined to bring the Levant under their heel. Armies marched from Nineveh and Asher, their ranks bristling with iron, their chariots rolling like thunder. Cities that resisted were besieged, their people slaughtered or deported. The smaller Aramean houses fell one by one, their walls shattered by Assyrian rams, their rulers led away in chains. Yet Damascus did not bend. In the year 853 BC, the storm broke at Karkar. On the banks of the Orontes River, the fate of the Levant hung in the balance. Assyrian king Shalmaneser III led a massive host westward, intent on crushing resistance in Syria. To face him, Ben-Hadad II forged a coalition unlike any seen before. Aramean states rallied under his banner, joined by Israelite chariots, Phoenician contingents, and even distant allies from Hamath and Cilicia. It was a gathering of peoples, once divided by rivalry, now united in desperation. The battle itself became legend. Dust rose like a storm cloud as thousands of horsemen clashed. Aramean chariots wheeled into Assyrian lines, their archers loosing volleys that darkened the sky. Israelite forces fought at their side, hurling spears into the advancing tide. The ground shook with the weight of armored ranks, and the cries of the dying mingled with the roar of drums and trumpets. Assyrian records, carved in stone, boast of victory. They claim Shalmaneser broke the coalition and scattered its armies. Yet the truth lies elsewhere. Damascus was not conquered. Its walls stood, its king survived, and its power endured for decades afterward. If Karkar was an Assyrian triumph, it was one that left Damascus unbroken and more feared than before. In the years that followed, Damascus remained the spear point of resistance. Smaller Aramean kingdoms fell, but Ben-Hadad's capital endured as the center of defiance. Assyrian armies could burn villages and deport thousands, but they could not easily uproot a city fortified by nature and determined by will. From its walls, the kings of Damascus continued to raid, levy tribute, and assert dominion over southern Syria and Israelite highlands alike. Still, the pressure mounted. The Assyrians returned again and again, each campaign tightening the noose. Towns allied with Damascus were razed, fortresses dismantled, orchards cut down. Trade routes once thriving under Aramean control came increasingly under Assyrian taxation. The Levant remained contested ground, but the weight of empire pressed heavier with each generation. Yet for the Arameans, and especially for Damascus, these centuries mark their zenith. Their kings commanded alliances, their armies could stand against the mightiest force of the age, and their language began spreading far beyond their homeland. Even as Assyria sought to crush them, the tongue of Damascus would soon become the language of the empire itself. The paradox was clear. Though political independence stood under constant threat, cultural influence grew unstoppable. Damascus rose to prove that the Arameans were more than raiders of the steppe. They were statesmen, generals, and kings who had written their names in blood upon the land of Canaan and Syria. The Battle of Karkar had shown the world that Aram could unite when pressed. And though the Assyrians marched on, they would never forget the day Ben-Hadad stood in their path. The drums of Damascus still echoed across the Ghouta plain, but beyond its walls, Assyrian shadows lengthened. The next age would bring siege after siege, deportations, and a slow grinding down of Aramean power. Yet even as their kingdoms faced disintegration, the Arameans had already secured something lasting. The rise of a culture, a language, and a spirit that would outlive the empires bent on their destruction. The victories of Damascus and its allies at Karkar did not stop the advance of Assyria for long. Beginning in the reign of Shalmaneser III in the mid-9th century BIC, the great Mesopotamian Empire returned to Syria year after year, determined to break Aramean resistance and bring the region under imperial control. From this point onward, the history of the Arameans is marked by a constant struggle with Assyrian power, sometimes open defiance, sometimes reluctant submission, but always shaped by the presence of an empire stronger than any single Aramean kingdom could withstand. Assyrian records describe these campaigns in detail. In 841 BC, Shalmaneser claimed victory over Hazael of Damascus, successor to Ben-Hadad II. According to his inscriptions, the Assyrian army defeated Hazael in battle, killing thousands and surrounding him in his capital. The Assyrian monarch boasted of cutting down orchards, burning villages, and carrying off spoils. Yet Damascus did not fall. The city withstood siege behind its strong walls, and Hazael preserved his throne, though the countryside around him lay devastated. The smaller Aramean states were not so fortunate. Kingdoms such as Bitadini and Bit-Halupe, already pressured by Assyria before Karkar, gradually disappeared from the political map. Their fortresses were destroyed, their ruling dynasties dethroned, and their populations deported eastward into Mesopotamia. The Assyrian practice of mass resettlement, moving whole communities into the Assyrian heartland, was designed to break resistance and prevent rebellion. For the Arameans, it meant that their people and language spread far beyond their homeland, even as their political independence eroded. Tribute became another mechanism of control. Assyrian kings demanded silver, gold, timber, horses, and agricultural produce from the Aramean states that submitted. In return, these kingdoms were permitted to retain local rulers, but under constant threat of renewed invasion. Annual tribute lists carved into stone stelae make clear which states yielded and which resisted. Damascus appears often in these records, sometimes as an enemy, sometimes as a tributary, depending on the balance of power in any given year. Such pressure intensified in the 8th century BC. Assyrian kings such as Adad-nirari III, Tiglath-Pileser III, and Shalmaneser V launched repeated campaigns into Syria. Each advance further reduced Aramean autonomy. Damascus remained the strongest of the Aramean powers, but even it could not hold indefinitely. By the time of Tiglath-Pileser, Damascus was annexed outright, its population deported, and its role as an independent kingdom brought to an end. The Assyrians imposed direct rule, stationing governors and garrisons in former Aramean cities. Smaller houses like Bit Bahiani or Bit Zamani disappeared entirely from the record, absorbed into Assyrian provinces. The countryside was resettled with deported peoples from other parts of the empire, while Aramean captives were transported east to Mesopotamia, where they were put to work as farmers, soldiers, or artisans. This policy was brutal, but it also had unintended cultural consequences. Arameans scattered across the empire carried their language with them. Aramaic, once spoken by tribes of the Syrian steppe, now became a common tongue of trade and daily life from the Levant to the Tigris. Assyrian officials still used Akkadian for inscriptions and formal state business, but in practical terms, Aramaic was easier to learn, simpler to write, and more widely understood. By resettling Arameans throughout their domains, the Assyrians unintentionally spread the very language of the people they were trying to subdue. Siege warfare defined much of this period. Assyrian reliefs carved in alabaster show the methods clearly. Soldiers advancing under large shields, sappers undermining walls, towers pushed against gates, and rams battering defenses. Fires lit by defenders pour down upon attackers, while ladders carry infantry up the ramparts. These depictions often portray Aramean cities, their towers bristling with defenders, their walls eventually crumbling under relentless assault. For the Assyrians, these images celebrated power. For the Arameans, they marked the destruction of independence, kingdom by kingdom. Yet even amid conquest, Aramean culture persisted. Local rulers who accepted Assyrian overlordship often retained ceremonial positions. Temples to Hadad and Atargatis remained active, though often supplemented by shrines to Assyrian gods. Local artisans continued to produce pottery, textiles, and inscriptions in their own style. Assimilation did not mean disappearance. Instead, Aramean identity adapted to new realities, finding ways to endure under imperial rule. Damascus's fate illustrates the trajectory of all Aramean states. Once the spearhead of resistance at Karkar, it fought for nearly a century against Assyrian advances. Under Hazael and his successors, it remained a formidable opponent, at times expanding into Israel and asserting dominance over neighboring states. But by 732 BC, Tiglath-Pileser III captured the city, executed its king, and deported much of its population. What had been the most powerful Aramean kingdom was reduced to an Assyrian province. From that point forward, no Aramean state exercised true independence. The legacy of their kingdoms survived only in memory and inscription, yet the people themselves lived on, spread throughout the empire, their language increasingly dominant in daily use. This paradox, political defeat but cultural expansion, defines the Aramean experience in the age of Assyria. The collapse of the smaller houses, the fall of Damascus, and the dispersal of populations all marked the end of Aramean sovereignty. But they also set the stage for the next transformation. Aramaic would become the lingua franca of the Near East, the script of empire and the bridge of cultures. What began as tribal speech in the Syrian steppe now carried contracts, correspondence, and decrees across thousands of miles. Thus, the period under Assyrian shadow is remembered less for the survival of independent kingdoms and more for the survival of identity. Political power was stripped away, but cultural influence only grew stronger. It was a contradiction that even the Assyrian monarchs, with all their armies and deportations, could not resolve. When Assyrian kings marched west to shatter the Aramean states, they sought to erase rivals, not to preserve them. Yet in destroying the political independence of the tribes, they unleashed something even more enduring. The Arameans lost their thrones and walls, but their tongue began to spread farther than any army could carry a banner. Within a few generations, Aramaic became the common medium of speech and writing across the Near East, adopted first out of necessity and then out of habit until even the conquerors could not do without it. It was deportation that shaped the outcome. Campaign after campaign ended with streams of exiles marching east. Peasants, fighters, clergy, women, and children pulled from Damascus, Hamath, and the river valleys. They were resettled in villages near the Tigris or in garrison towns on the Median frontier. In their new homes, they continued to speak their native dialects, teaching them to neighbors and children alike. What had been a local language of the steppe became a shared speech in the fields, in the markets, and eventually in the provincial offices of empire. Meanwhile, Akkadian still carried the weight of tradition. It had been the written language of Mesopotamia for 2,000 years, preserved in hymns, chronicles, and royal inscriptions. Its cuneiform script required years of training to master, a skill reserved for a narrow scholarly class. Aramaic differed sharply. Its alphabet, adapted from Phoenician, could be learned in months. Its structure was clear and flexible. Its kinship with Hebrew, Phoenician, and other Semitic tongues made it easily understood across cultural boundaries. In an empire knit together by roads and armies, efficiency counted more than heritage. Scribes bridged the gap. Many came from deported Aramean families, raised in Mesopotamia but fluent in their ancestral tongue. They served as translators for governors, copied orders into Aramaic so provincial officials could read them, and kept tax accounts on leather and papyrus instead of heavy clay tablets. Palaces in Nineveh and Kalhu stored archives where Akkadian tablets lay beside Aramaic documents, evidence of a bilingual bureaucracy. For routine matters, rations for soldiers, shipments of timber, delivery of tribute, Aramaic proved far more practical. Scenes carved into Assyrian reliefs show these scribes at work. Behind the king, who receives tribute, two men stand recording tallies, one incising cuneiform signs onto clay, the other writing with ink on parchment. The dual system embodied the empire itself, Akkadian for permanence, Aramaic for reach. Every soldier conscripted from Syria, every merchant stopping at an Assyrian caravanserai, every official posted far from home relied on the latter. The rise of the language was carried further through diplomacy. When Assyrian messengers addressed neighboring rulers, Aramaic served as the link. A scene remembered in the Hebrew Bible illustrates this moment. As the Assyrian army besieged Jerusalem, Judean officials pleaded with the envoys, "Speak to your servants in Aramaic, for we understand it. Do not speak to us in Hebrew within earshot of the people on the wall." That exchange, preserved in scripture, shows how widely Aramaic was understood among elites by the 8th century BC. It had become the medium through which kings and generals negotiated, even when neither side was Aramean by birth. Its reach stretched with the merchants. Caravans crossing the passes from Anatolia into Mesopotamia wrote their accounts in Aramaic. Traders on the Phoenician coast scrawled graffiti in the script as they traveled. From the Nile Delta to the Taurus Mountains, short messages survive scratched on pottery and stone, proving that ordinary merchants carried the alphabet wherever they went. Soldiers stationed far from home left their names in Aramaic characters on walls, a mark of identity and continuity in foreign lands. In a world of constant movement, the tongue of the Arameans became the shared currency of exchange. By the time of Tiglath-Pileser III in the mid-8th century, the shift was undeniable. His sweeping reforms reorganized the empire into provinces, and the officials who managed them leaned heavily on Aramaic scribes. Governors posted in Syria or along the Mediterranean coast needed a language that could be understood locally as well as in the capital. Aramaic filled that role with ease. Even when orders were drafted in Akkadian, they were swiftly copied into Aramaic to ensure they reached the people who had to carry them out. Later, rulers continued the practice. Under Sennacherib, whose armies razed Babylon and campaigned into Judah, correspondence moved in both languages, but Aramaic increasingly dominated the day-to-day. His son, Esarhaddon, famous for conquering Egypt, carried Aramaic scribes with him on campaign. When Assyrian authority extended to Thebes, the language of Syrian tribes was heard along the Nile, carried by administrators who tallied supplies and transmitted orders. In this way, a people stripped of their independence gained influence of another kind. The Arameans no longer ruled Damascus or Hamath, but their words governed the empire that conquered them. The irony would not have been lost on contemporaries. Every tribute list, every contract, every order, shouted by a soldier in Aramaic, testified to the persistence of a culture that seemed to have been politically erased. Even monuments reflect this duality. Akkadian inscriptions proclaimed the eternal power of Assyrian kings, yet on the reverse side of some stele, short notes in Aramaic marked the year or summarized the event. Clay bore the script of tradition. Parchment and papyrus bore the script of practice. The latter rarely survives, yet enough fragments remain to show how thoroughly it had spread. By the 7th century BC, no official could hope to function across the empire without some command of Aramaic. Governors used it to correspond with each other, generals used it to issue orders, and tax collectors used it to record deliveries. In provincial towns, villagers who had never seen Nineveh or Asher still learned Aramaic phrases to bargain with soldiers or to understand the demands of imperial overseers. A language born on the margins had become the connective tissue of an empire. Its reach extended beyond administration and trade. Religious texts, prayers, and incantations began to appear in Aramaic alongside Akkadian. Stories and wisdom traditions passed orally among Aramean communities, found written form in the new alphabetic script. What began as a tool of governance became a vehicle of cultural expression, preserving identity for a people scattered across provinces. With the fall of Assyria in 612 BC, Aramaic's dominance was already unshakable. Akkadian continued in temples and royal inscriptions, but it was increasingly a language of the past. Aramaic carried the empire's present and would carry the future. The story of this period is not of kings or battles, but of words. A speech once confined to steppe tribes traveled with deportees, merchants, and soldiers, until it became the everyday voice of millions. Empires had crushed the Arameans' independence, yet every edict written in their language revealed the limits of conquest. What Assyria sought to erase, it ended up preserving on a scale the Arameans themselves could never have imagined. Pressure from Assyria had mounted for generations, but in 744 BC, a ruler came to the throne who changed the balance of power forever. Tiglath-Pileser III did not rely on seasonal raids or temporary tribute. He reorganized the empire into a machine of permanent conquest, building a standing army supplied year-round and a system of provinces that tied conquered lands directly to Nineveh. Syria, long a contested borderland, became the first proving ground for this new strategy. One by one, the Aramean states were dismantled. Fortresses along the Euphrates, once ruled by independent houses, were reduced to rubble or rebuilt as Assyrian garrisons. Kings who had once bargained for tribute were replaced by governors appointed from the capital. Roads were secured by chains of forts. and markets were forced to pay standardized tolls that filled imperial treasuries. The decisive moment came in 732 BC, when Damascus itself finally fell. For a century, the city had led resistance against Assyria, standing at Karkar and battling Israel and Judah with equal force. Tiglath-Pileser marched west with overwhelming numbers, besieged the city, and captured it after bitter fighting. Its last king was executed, elite families were deported eastward, and its fertile plain was divided into districts directly managed by the empire. What had been the strongest Aramean state became an Assyrian province overnight. After conquest came deportation. Syrian populations were wrenched from their homes and driven to the Assyrian core or to distant borderlands. Families from Damascus, Hamath, and Arpad were transported to the plains of Mesopotamia, where they farmed new fields under imperial oversight. In their place, other deported peoples were moved west to repopulate emptied villages. By breaking old networks and mixing populations, Assyria weakened resistance. But the policy also ensured that Aramaic spread even further, carried by migrants who taught it to their new neighbors. The empire's armies absorbed vast numbers of Arameans. Horsemen from the Syrian lowlands were prized for swift discipline, while archers and slingers of the hills fought as nimble infantry. Charioteers maintained equipment for provincial forces, keeping alive skills once turned against Assyria itself. Reliefs from Nineveh show Syrian cavalry beside Median and Assyrian infantry, all under the same banners. Conquered peoples were no longer enemies, but soldiers of the empire. Alongside the armies came the artisans. From the Orontes Valley, carpenters hauled cedar for palaces. Masons carved the stones of shrines and portals. Smiths hammered bronze and iron for war. Workshops in Kalhu and Nineveh displayed the results. Ivory panels carved in Syrian style decorated Assyrian thrones, while furniture inlaid with Phoenician patterns furnished palatial rooms. Conquest had destroyed Aramean states, yet their artistry flourished at the heart of imperial culture. It was administration that tied the realm together. Former royal cities became provincial hubs, their governors charged with taxes, courts, and levies. Akkadian filled monuments, while Aramaic kept the empire running day to day. Market contracts, supply lists, and correspondence moved more easily in the alphabetic script than in cumbersome cuneiform. In governors' courts, a decree might be drafted in Akkadian for the archives, then copied into Aramaic so it could be acted upon swiftly in the provinces. Two scripts served the empire, but one increasingly carried its weight. Belief systems merged as well. Syrian deities of storm were joined to Adad, the Assyrian god who ruled the skies. Local great ladies of fertility and war merged with Ishtar in shared rituals. In the names preserved on tablets, families combined traditions. Hadad alongside Adad, Atargatis alongside Ishtar. Provincial governors funded repairs to Syrian temples, ensuring loyalty, while priests adapted calendars and festivals to align with imperial expectations. Conquest did not erase local devotion. It reshaped it to fit within a wider framework. In annexed towns, the pattern was clear. Army stores were filled from lands seized from dynasts, and trade still flowed along the roads, now measured by tolls exacted at the empire's gates. Villages continued to hold seasonal councils to settle disputes, but their judgments were written down by Aramaic clerks and confirmed by governors. Ordinary life persisted, but always under the gaze of officials whose authority came from Nineveh. Influence flowed both ways. Assyrian court dress absorbed Syrian garments, and musicians from the west played at imperial banquets. Provincial nobles adopted Assyrian architectural styles for their homes, while decorating interiors with native designs. Local laws on water rights or grazing continued in practice, but recorded now in formats recognized by imperial judges. Daily life was a negotiation between old customs and new order, a cultural fusion forged under the weight of empire. Damascus, even stripped of independence, retained economic importance. Its canals and orchards were restored to provide food for garrisons, and its markets continued to channel goods from Arabia and Phoenicia into the imperial system. The city no longer set policy, but it remained a hub of wealth and influence. Assyrian power had silenced its kings, yet the prosperity of the oasis still spoke loudly in provincial accounts. Later, kings continued what Tiglath-Pileser had begun. Shalmaneser V, Sargon II, and Sennacherib all campaigned in the west, stamping out uprisings and ensuring the provinces remained secure. Syrian troops marched with Assyrian armies into Philistia and Egypt, while Syrian scribes carried their alphabetic script to Memphis and Thebes. By the reign of Esarhaddon, Aramean families and their language were embedded across every level of imperial life. No Aramean kingdom remained sovereign. Each had been folded into the dominion of others. Yet their influence was unmistakable. Soldiers bearing Syrian names guarded imperial frontiers. Craftsmen from the Euphrates furnished palaces, and scribes of Aramean descent recorded the orders of kings. The people once cursed as raiders had become indispensable to the empire that conquered them. Assyria imposed order with iron, but it could not erase memory. Villages in Syria still told stories of ancestral houses, even as their sons marched in Assyrian ranks. Priests still invoked Hadad, though they now offered incense alongside prayers to Assyrian deities. And across the empire, the language of Aram carried daily life, ensuring that the conquered spoke with one voice even as their thrones were gone. When Nineveh itself fell in 612 BC, the empire crumbled, but Aramaic remained. The culture that had been folded into Assyrian strength endured beyond Assyria's collapse, ready to shape the next power that would rise from its ruins. When Nineveh's walls crumbled in 612 BC and the Assyrian throne fell, Western captives, scribes, and soldiers who had long served under Assyria awoke to a new master. The Babylonian dynasty of Nabopolassar and his son Nebuchadnezzar seized the inheritance of empire. They kept the provinces, the networks of roads and garrisons, and above all, the habits of administration that Assyria had built. In this new order, Arameans did not return to independence. They remained scattered, interwoven with other peoples. But their words, their skills, and their presence continued to shape the life of Mesopotamia. Babylon became the magnet for this mixed world. Nebuchadnezzar II, who ruled from 605 BC, filled his capital with projects on a scale to rival any city before it. Walls rose that encircled the metropolis. A processional way paved in stone led to the Ishtar Gate, and temples gleamed with new brick and cedar beams. Labor came from every corner of the realm. Carpenters from Syrian valleys cut timbers, masons shaped stone, and deported families carried bricks to the kilns. Languages mingled on the work sites, but in the shouting of orders and the tallying of wages, Aramaic made the job possible. The streets of Babylon reflected that same mixture. Merchants from Tyre and Sidon unloaded amphorae of wine. Caravans from Hamath and Damascus brought wool, dried fruit, and timber. Traders from Anatolia and beyond arrived with metals. Markets had to find a common tongue, and the speech of the Arameans provided it. Akkadian was still carved into monuments and tablets, but at the stalls of bazaar, deals were struck in Aramaic. In the chancery offices, scribes trained in both traditions worked side by side. Akkadian cuneiform remained the language of long contracts, temple inventories, and formal decrees, but day-to-day instructions ran on parchment or wooden boards covered in alphabetic script. Governors in distant provinces used it to keep in touch with the capital. Soldiers used it for musters and ration lists, and merchants trusted it for receipts. What had begun under Assyrian rule now became routine. Babylonian officials could not govern without Aramaic scribes. The collapse of Judah added another layer. Deportations in 597 BC and again in 586 BC carried waves of Judeans into Mesopotamia. They joined Westerners who had been resettled there for generations. Arameans from Damascus and Hamath, Phoenicians from the coast, and Israelites from earlier conflicts. In villages along canals and in new quarters of the capital, they spoke to one another in a language they all recognized. Aramaic bridged their differences and became the medium through which exile communities rebuilt their lives. Agriculture bound many of these exiles together. Families from Syria and Judah alike were placed on canal-fed fields outside Babylon. They dug irrigation channels, sowed barley and wheat, and delivered their dues to officials who recorded them in a language they could all understand. Local councils still settled disputes over water and boundaries, but clerks noted their judgments in Aramaic script so that provincial officers could confirm them. Farming tied the exiles to their new land, and their words tied them to one another. Inside Babylon, the great temples of Marduk and Nabu dominated the skyline, yet immigrant communities kept their own devotions alive. Household shrines to Hadad or Atargatis stood in back rooms. Incense rose to Yahweh in exile homes, and prayers were whispered in familiar cadences even under foreign skies. Names carved on potsherds and contracts preserved this blend. Children given titles that honored both the gods of their ancestors and those of their new city. Worship had shifted, but memory endured. Trade continued to expand the role of Aramaic. Caravans traveling from Phoenicia into Mesopotamia carried their records in alphabetic script. Graffiti scratched onto amphorae, or the walls of warehouses bear witness to the presence of merchants from the Levant in Babylon's markets. Even in Egypt, after Babylon's armies campaigned there, Aramaic words appeared on ostraca, proof that the language had traveled with soldiers and quartermasters to new frontiers. Daily life showed the same pattern. Boatmen on the Euphrates shouted instructions in Aramaic as they guided rafts of timber downstream. Quartermasters checked cargoes and barked tallies to scribes who recorded them with quick strokes of the alphabet. Soldiers drawn from Syrian families drilled beside Babylonians, understanding one another through the common tongue. In every corner of the empire, the speech of the Arameans was no longer the mark of a people. It had become the fabric of empire. Nebuchadnezzar's projects demanded organization on a massive scale, and Westerners filled every niche. Foremen from deported communities supervised gangs on construction sites. Craftsmen from Arpad and Damascus worked ivory and metal for the palaces. And musicians from Phoenicia played in court ceremonies. None of them ruled, but all of them shaped the empire's daily rhythm. When Nabonidus rose to the throne in 556 BC, he extended these habits even into Arabia. His years at Taima, an oasis on the caravan routes, were supplied by scribes and officials who carried with them the practices already normal in Babylon. Aramaic inscriptions from that desert region prove how far the script had traveled. From the streets of Damascus to the wells of Arabia, the words of the Arameans connected far-flung posts of empire. Communities of exiles also reshaped themselves through language. Among the Judeans, prayers and traditions took on new form in Aramaic, setting the stage for scripture and commentary in the centuries to come. Among older Aramaean families, long settled in Mesopotamia, the tongue preserved kinship across distance. A farmer near Nippur and a craftsman in Babylon might never have met, but their children grew up speaking the same words. The old tongue of Akkadian survived in ritual and learning, but Aramaic carried the weight of daily speech. It was the language of soldiers on campaign, merchants on the move, and villagers paying rent. It carried the commands of kings and the prayers of exiles. The Neo-Babylonian Empire had risen on the ruins of Assyria, but in one respect, it merely continued what had already begun: the spread of Aramaic across the Near East. As Cyrus of Persia entered Babylon, he took possession of an empire already knit together by this tongue. His officials would soon standardize it further, but the foundations had been laid during the Babylonian century. Arameans no longer ruled their own kingdoms, yet their language ruled the world they lived in. By the time Persia replaced Babylon at the center of power, the officials of the new empire quickly realized they had inherited more than territory. They had taken on a working system of roads, provinces, and scribes that already ran on Aramaic. Rather than impose their own tongue, Persian rulers expanded this habit, standardizing the alphabet and training clerks so that a decree from Susa could be read just as easily in Sardis or Bactria. From the beginning, the Achaemenid monarchy ruled through the words of a people who no longer held kingdoms of their own. In the first years of Persian rule, deported peoples scattered through Mesopotamia began to move again. Some Judeans returned to their homeland with imperial blessing, while many remained in Babylon and Nippur, where their fields and shops tied them to neighbors. Phoenicians and Arameans, who had been resettled under earlier kings, now lived beside newcomers from Lydia, Elam, and Media. The empire's strength lay in its diversity, but diversity needed a common tongue, and Aramaic provided it. Across the new satrapies established by Darius I, royal decrees reached local governors who translated them into the alphabetic script. Stone monuments in Old Persian proclaimed victories in 3 languages, yet the orders that sent tax collectors into villages were copied in Aramaic. The alphabet had been standardized for clarity, letters more regular, spelling more consistent, so that a document written in Susa could be read without hesitation in Sardis or Bactria. Imperial Aramaic became the nervous system of the empire. In provincial towns, scribes unrolled parchment and wrote lists of barley deliveries or tallies of draft animals. Governors carried these papers to their courts, where officials read them aloud to audiences drawn from many peoples. For villagers, the sound was familiar. They had grown up speaking dialects close to this imperial tongue, and even if their accent differed, they understood. Communication worked where it mattered most, on the ground, between those who gave orders and those who carried them out. The roads of the empire amplified this habit. Royal couriers galloped from Sardis to Susa, stopping at way stations where fresh horses waited. Messages written in Aramaic passed through dozens of hands but retained their clarity. A satrap in Anatolia could receive instructions from the king in weeks rather than months, and he could pass them on to local officers without confusion. The empire's famed speed of communication owed much to this choice of language. Caravans moved along the same routes, their cargoes registered by clerks trained in the imperial script. Amphorae of wine from the Aegean coast, blocks of cedar from Lebanon, and sacks of frankincense from Arabia all carried tags marked in Aramaic. In marketplaces as far apart as Sardis and Persepolis, merchants found themselves able to bargain in a tongue they shared. Greek traders, at first outsiders, learned enough to work with Persian officials, while sailors along the Red Sea scratched quick notes in Aramaic on storage jars. In garrisons, the language spread even more quickly. Soldiers recruited from Egypt, Anatolia, and Central Asia trained side by side, each bringing their own native words. To serve under one command, they needed a common medium. Muster rolls, ration lists, and commands on campaign were written in Aramaic. Reliefs from Persepolis show contingents from across the empire presenting tribute. Behind that ceremony, scribes bent over boards and copied records in the alphabetic hand, ensuring that contributions from distant satrapies were counted. Religious communities also relied on the script. In Babylon, temples to Marduk and Nabu remained central to ritual life, but immigrant groups recorded their prayers in their own way. At Elephantine in Egypt, papyri from a garrison of Judeans preserve hymns, blessings, and contracts sworn in the name of the God of heaven. The same hand that wrote down pay, slips for soldiers also carried petitions for rebuilding their temple. Faiths stayed distinct, but their paperwork shared a language. Court life in Persia mirrored this duality. Old Persian remained the language of royal proclamations carved into cliffs and palaces, while Aramaic kept the empire running. At Persepolis, monumental inscriptions celebrated the king's achievements, but the day-to-day archives, rations of wine for work crews, allocations of grain for laborers, shipments of stone, were written in Aramaic. These records reveal a workforce drawn from every corner of the empire. Men and women from Elam, Media, Anatolia, and Syria, all supplied according to the same lists, all counted in the same script. Aramaic did not erase local languages, but it overshadowed them in official life. Akkadian still lingered in Babylonian temples. Egyptian was spoken in the Nile Valley. Greek thrived in Anatolia, and Old Persian marked royal identity. Yet when people from these backgrounds met under imperial authority, they turned to Aramaic. It became the medium of markets, garrisons, provincial courts, and caravanserais. For the descendants of the Arameans themselves, this dominance carried irony. Their dynasties had been erased, their thrones broken, their names replaced by Persian satraps, yet their words bound the empire together. An Aramean farmer in Syria might never see Persepolis, but scribes in Persepolis used his language to record the empire's accounts. Identity blurred into the larger fabric of empire, while the tongue of their ancestors endured. From Egypt to India, evidence of this system survives. Ostraca, papyri, and inscriptions reveal the same standardized hand. A letter from a provincial officer in Bactria echoes the style of one written in the Levant. Traders in Memphis left graffiti on walls in Aramaic script, while Jewish communities in Babylonia copied prayers in the same letters. Across distances unimaginable to the first nomadic tribes of the Syrian steppe, their language had become universal. Under Darius and Xerxes, the empire came to depend on it completely. Orders flowed swiftly, taxes were counted accurately, and soldiers marched in coordination. Aramaic had grown from the dialect of wandering clans into the administrative backbone of 3 continents. When Alexander the Great crossed into Asia in 334 BC, he carried not only Macedonian ambitions, but a language that would reshape the eastern Mediterranean. Greek spread swiftly through the cities he conquered, planted in colonies, and upheld by the courts of his successors. Yet beneath the new tongue and new rulers, Aramaic endured. It had already proven itself indispensable in the empires of Assyria, Babylon, and Persia, and it did not vanish with the arrival of Greek soldiers. Instead, the two languages lived side by side, each serving a different role in the Hellenistic world. The conquest itself moved quickly. By 331 BC, after the Battle of Gaugamela, the Persian Empire was broken, and Alexander stood as master of the lands once ruled from Persepolis. Babylon welcomed him, its streets filled with soldiers from Greece and Asia alike. In his entourage marched administrators, who brought with them Greek as the language of the court, but they could not ignore the script already woven into the life of the empire. Aramaic remained the medium through which local officials, traders, and farmers managed their affairs. After Alexander's death in 323 BC, his generals divided the territories, and Syria fell under the rule of the Seleucids. From Antioch, their newly founded capital on the Orontes, they sought to stamp Greek culture onto the region. Cities were redesigned with theatres, gymnasia, and agoras, each a showcase of Hellenic life. Greek became the language of administration, coinage, and education. Yet in the countryside and in older towns, Aramaic continued as the speech of daily exchange. The empire might celebrate its Greekness, but the voices of its villagers told another story. Antioch itself embodied this duality. Its avenues echoed with Greek in the assemblies and courts, while in its markets one could hear a mix of tongues. Greek shouted by officials, Aramaic spoken by farmers from the hinterland, and Phoenician among sailors at the docks. Inscriptions in the city bear witness to this blend, sometimes carved in Greek letters, sometimes scratched in Aramaic script. Antioch may have been founded as a Hellenistic showpiece, but it could not silence the language that tied together the countryside around it. In smaller towns, the balance was even clearer. Along the Euphrates, in villages that had once been part of Bit Adini or Bit Halupe, daily life changed little under the Seleucids. Farmers tilled the same fields. Priests tended shrines to gods that blended Aramean and Greek traits, and scribes recorded contracts in the script their ancestors had used for centuries. Greek inscriptions appeared on temples and official monuments, but the alphabet of Aram remained etched on ostraca and clay fragments that passed between neighbors. Religious practice provided a meeting point of cultures. Temples to Zeus rose in Seleucid cities, yet the god was often identified with Hadad, the old storm deity of Syria. Local communities continued to honor Atargatis, the great lady of northern shrines, even as Greek settlers associated her with Aphrodite or Hera. In inscriptions, dedications appear in Greek, but the prayers spoken aloud often carried the cadence of Aramaic. Faith blended traditions, but it did not erase the old tongue. Trade reinforced the persistence of Aramaic. Caravans moving from Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean continued to use it as their working language. Greek merchants learned enough to manage deals in inland markets, while local traders sometimes picked up Greek to handle transactions in coastal ports. Along the caravan routes, bilingualism became common, a practical response to the overlapping worlds of city and countryside. For every Greek inscription on a milestone, there was an Aramaic note scratched on a jar or a contract written in the alphabet that had served empires before. Military service also spread this coexistence. Seleucid armies recruited locally, drawing on Syrian horsemen and archers to supplement Greek phalanxes. Orders at the top were given in Greek, but in the ranks, Aramaic echoed among soldiers who came from villages across Syria and Mesopotamia. On campaign, officers relied on interpreters who bridged the two tongues. War did not suppress the language of the Arameans. It carried it into new contexts. Education created sharper divisions. In cities like Antioch, gymnasia taught Greek literature and philosophy, cultivating an elite loyal to Hellenistic ideals. Boys of wealthy families read Homer and trained in rhetoric. Meanwhile, in villages, oral traditions preserved Aramaic songs, proverbs, and stories. The divide between city and countryside grew, yet contact between them was constant. Farmers brought produce into urban markets, and city officials traveled to rural estates, ensuring that both languages encountered one another every day. Some communities chose to bridge the gap deliberately. Inscriptions from towns along the Orontes and Euphrates appear in both Greek and Aramaic, sometimes even within the same dedication. Names tell a similar story. Children baptized in temples bore Greek and Aramaic elements together, evidence of families navigating two cultural spheres at once. These choices were practical as much as symbolic, ensuring that a child's name resonated in the village and carried weight in the city. Palmyra offers a glimpse of how this fusion took shape on the desert's edge, though its greatest rise came later. In the Roman period, its roots lay in the Hellenistic age. Caravan traders there used Aramaic in their contracts, while Greek appeared on official inscriptions. The coexistence of the two tongues gave Palmyra the tools to grow into a cosmopolitan hub, foreshadowing the role it would play centuries later. In Judea, too, the mixture was evident. After Alexander's conquests, Greek influence spread through cities of the Levant, but the countryside continued to speak Aramaic. Even the Maccabean revolt in the 2nd century BC unfolded in a bilingual world. Greek inscriptions adorned fortresses, while Aramaic remained the language of villagers and priests. Out of this dual setting would emerge traditions that carried forward into the Roman period, shaping the religious landscape of the Near East. As the dynasty weakened, the Seleucid realm faced pressure, both from within and from surrounding powers. Parthian power rose in the east, and Rome pressed in from the west. Yet through the turbulence, Aramaic did not fade. Its endurance owed less to official patronage than to the millions who spoke it every day. Greek may have ruled the courts and academies, but the countryside, the caravans, and the shrines still echoed with the speech of Aram. The Hellenistic centuries reshaped the Near East. Cities like Antioch projected Greek identity. Coins bore Greek legends, and philosophy schools debated in Greek terms. Yet beneath the monuments and the rhetoric, a second current flowed. Aramaic endured in households, markets, and villages. It was not the language of power, but it remained the language of life. And when Greek influence waned, it would be Aramaic, not Greek, that carried forward into the next age. In 64 BC, Pompey brought Syria under Roman control, ending a century of turmoil among the last Seleucid rulers. Rome did not start from scratch. It inherited cities built in the Hellenistic age, caravan routes that tied the Mediterranean to Mesopotamia, and populations long accustomed to living in a bilingual world. Greek remained the language of urban elites. Latin was introduced as the language of empire, but Aramaic endured in the countryside. Over the coming centuries, that persistence would give rise to a distinct cultural form, Syriac. Antioch stood at the center of the new province. Founded by Seleucus more than 2 centuries earlier, the city already boasted colonnaded streets, markets, and a theater that reflected its Greek character. Under Roman administration, Antioch grew into one of the great cities of the empire, rivaled only by Alexandria in the east. Governors resided there, senatorial envoys came and went, and emperors themselves visited. Latin appeared in official decrees, but in daily life, Greek dominated. theatres echoed with comedies and tragedies in Greek, while schools taught Homer and rhetoric to the sons of local notables. Yet Antioch was never only a Greek city. Farmers from the Orontes Valley arrived in its markets with produce, speaking Aramaic. Traders from inland towns brought wool, hides, and fruit, haggling in the same tongue. In the city's back streets, inscriptions scratched on walls preserve Aramaic words alongside Greek graffiti. Antioch's grandeur rested on a hinterland that was overwhelmingly Aramaic-speaking. While governors and philosophers spoke Greek in public square, the language of the countryside filled the markets and workshops. Palmyra revealed another side of Roman Syria. Lying on the desert's edge, it linked the Mediterranean to Mesopotamia. Caravans loaded with silk from China, spices from Arabia, and gems from India stopped there before moving west. Greek appeared on public monuments, but contracts drawn up by merchant families often used Aramaic. Tomb inscriptions in Palmyra display both languages, sometimes on the same stone. Greek to honor the city's cosmopolitan status, Aramaic to anchor identity in older traditions. Rome granted Palmyra a degree of autonomy precisely because of its role in trade. In that autonomy, Aramaic culture thrived in tandem with Roman political power. Other towns along the Euphrates, such as Dura Europos, tell a similar story. Excavations have uncovered temples where inscriptions appear in Greek, Latin, Aramaic, and even Persian. Soldiers stationed there left graffiti in the languages they knew, while local contracts continued to rely on Aramaic. Dura was a frontier post, a meeting place of empires, and in its multilingual remains, we see how Aramaic lived on, even in the shadow of Rome's legions. Worship stood as testimony to their endurance. Jupiter and Venus appeared in temples across Syria, but they were often merged with Hadad and Atargates, the storm god and the great lady of Syrian devotion. At Heliopolis, the cult of Jupiter was indistinguishable from older traditions tied to local fertility gods. Worshippers prayed in Greek, but in rural sanctuaries, prayers rose in Aramaic. Families preserved old rites in household shrines, and names recorded in village contracts kept the memory of ancient deities alive. Rome absorbed local gods rather than erasing them, and through this syncretism, Aramaic-speaking communities preserved their spiritual heritage. In the Roman army, language served practical needs. Latin was the command language of legions, and Greek was widely used in the East, but Aramaic interpreters were indispensable. Auxiliaries recruited from Syrian villages carried their mother tongue with them. Muster rolls, supply tallies, and camp orders often relied on scribes who could shift between Latin and Aramaic. When soldiers from Syria marched to the Danube or the Rhine, they took their words with them, leaving behind inscriptions that show how far the language had traveled within Rome's military machine. The pattern held in trade. Wine, oil, grain, and textiles passed down the caravan lines, with Aramaic as the common speech. A caravan leaving Mesopotamia might carry its documentation in Aramaic until it reached Antioch, where Greek scribes translated it for officials. In port cities along the coast, Greek dominated contracts, but in inland markets, Aramaic still set the terms of exchange. Rome imposed order through roads, milestones, and tolls, but the conversations at checkpoints were often carried out in the words of Aram. Knowledge itself widened the gap. In Antioch and other Roman cities, the upper classes raised their children on Greek writings and philosophy. Rhetoric schools trained future orators in the classics of Athens. Meanwhile, in rural villages, oral traditions carried on in Aramaic. Proverbs, folk tales, and songs passed from elders to children. This difference created cultural distance between city elites and countryside populations. Yet interaction between them never ceased. Farmers came into cities to sell produce. City officials visited villages to collect taxes, and bilingualism became a necessity. Out of this bilingual world, Syriac would take shape as a literary language of its own. By the 1st century AD, Syriac was becoming more than a spoken dialect. Communities in Edessa, Nisibis, and other northern Mesopotamian towns began to use it for inscriptions and documents. While Greek still carried prestige in the cities of Roman Syria, Syriac was emerging as the written form of Aramaic that preserved the culture of the countryside. This development did not happen overnight, but the conditions were set. Roman administration tolerated local languages, and Aramaic communities were strong enough to sustain their traditions. Edessa deserves special mention. Situated on the frontier between Rome and Parthia, it became a crucible of Syriac identity. Kings of Osroene, the small state that held Edessa, patronized the use of Syriac alongside Greek. Inscriptions and early documents from the city demonstrate the shift from spoken dialect to literary language. Under Roman oversight, Edessa functioned as both a loyal client state and a beacon of local culture. Its example would echo through centuries as Syriac Christianity took root there. Roman Syria was therefore not a land of simple domination, but of complex coexistence. Latin marked imperial authority, Greek defined the cities, and Aramaic, emerging as Syriac, remained the voice of the countryside and increasingly of a written culture. Each layer interacted with the others. A Roman decree might be issued in Latin, proclaimed in Greek, and discussed by villagers in Aramaic. In that layered world, identity was not erased but reshaped. With Rome established in the region, Syriac found space to grow, blending the heritage of Aramean speech with the realities of imperial rule. Villagers praying in their own tongue, scribes recording contracts in local script, and kings of frontier cities supporting its use all laid the groundwork. Rome had brought Syria into its orbit, but it could not extinguish the words spoken in its fields and homes. Instead, those words adapted and prepared for a new age of cultural expression. The desert city of Palmyra had long thrived on its location between empires. From Roman Syria to the Euphrates stretched a corridor of caravan routes, and at the midpoint rose this oasis town, sustained by wells and palm groves. Traders from Mesopotamia halted there before moving on to the Mediterranean coast, while merchants from Phoenicia and Arabia paused before heading east. By the 3rd century, AD Palmyra had become one of the wealthiest cities in the Roman world, its prosperity rooted in commerce and its identity expressed through a striking blend of Aramaic and Greek culture. Stone colonnades lined the main avenue, temples rose with classical facades, and inscriptions adorned civic buildings. Greek appeared on official monuments, proclaiming Palmyra's loyalty to Rome and its place in the empire. Yet beside those Greek texts, Aramaic words were carved in equal measure. Merchant families left bilingual dedications to their gods, recording names that tied them both to their Aramean ancestry and to the cosmopolitan world of Roman Syria. Tombs in the Valley of the Tombs bear witness to this dual heritage, their reliefs combining Eastern motifs with Hellenistic style, their inscriptions written in both scripts. Palmyra's position as a caravan hub gave it leverage. Merchants there controlled the flow of silk, spices, incense, and precious stones from the east, levying tolls and providing security for caravans. Their wealth was invested in monumental architecture, the great Temple of Bel, the theatre, the agora. The city's leaders used trade profits to present themselves as loyal subjects of Rome, sending troops to assist in campaigns and maintaining order in the desert. In return, the empire granted Palmyra a degree of autonomy. Its council and magistrates governed much of its internal affairs, and its merchants grew rich under imperial protection. By the middle of the 3rd century, however, the Roman world was in crisis. Civil wars, economic instability, and invasions on the Rhine and Danube weakened the empire's grip on the east. The Sasanian dynasty in Persia pressed into Mesopotamia, seizing Roman fortresses and threatening Syria. In this moment of instability, Palmyra emerged as more than a trading hub. Under its powerful rulers, it became a regional power in its own right. Odenathus, a Palmyrene nobleman, rose to prominence in the 200s and 50s. When the Persians captured the Roman Emperor Valerian in 260 AD, the eastern provinces seemed vulnerable. Odenathus rallied Palmyrene forces, fought back the Persians, and restored stability to Syria. Rome, unable to secure the frontier itself, recognized his authority. He was given titles such as Corrector of the East, and for a time, Palmyra functioned almost as an independent kingdom under his leadership, loyal in name to Rome, but ruling effectively on its own. After his death, power passed to his widow, Zenobia. Few women in antiquity commanded the stage as she did. Confident, ambitious, and charismatic, Zenobia claimed descent from Cleopatra and presented herself as a queen of both East and West. She governed on behalf of her young son, Vabalithus, but soon made her own ambitions clear. Where Odenathus had balanced between loyalty to Rome and assertion of local power, Zenobia pushed further. Under her rule, Palmyrene armies expanded into neighboring provinces. Egypt, a crucial source of grain for Rome, fell under her control. Asia Minor saw Palmyrene garrisons. Coins were minted in her name and her son's, signaling a new claim to sovereignty. For a brief moment, Palmyra seemed poised to create an empire of its own, stretching from the Nile to the Euphrates, with Zenobia at its head. Throughout this expansion, Aramaic identity remained visible. Inscriptions from the period show continued use of Aramaic alongside Greek, even as Palmyra claimed imperial titles. The city's resilience rested on its cultural duality. It could project itself as a Greco-Roman city in architecture and coinage, while still drawing on the loyalty of Aramaic-speaking tribes in the desert. Zenobia's power depended on both, fusing the traditions of the caravan city with the trappings of empire. Rome eventually responded. In 272 AD, the Emperor Aurelian marched east, determined to restore unity. His legions advanced through Asia Minor and Syria, defeating Palmyrene forces in battle. Zenobia retreated to Palmyra, where she prepared for a siege. Ancient sources describe her attempting to secure aid from Persia, but before such help could arrive, she was captured while trying to escape across the Euphrates. Brought to Rome, she was paraded in Aurelian's triumph, a symbol of the empire's restored authority. Palmyra did not recover from the blow. A rebellion in 273 AD led to its sack by Roman troops, and its monuments fell into ruin. The grand avenues and temples that once proclaimed its wealth stood silent, their stones later buried in desert sands. The brief dream of a Palmyrene empire ended, and Rome reasserted direct control over Syria. Yet the legacy of Palmyra's revolt endured. Inscriptions from the city, many bilingual, reveal a society where Aramaic remained strong, even under Greek and Roman influence. The persistence of the language in dedications, contracts, and tombs testifies to its deep roots. While Zenobia's political ambitions failed, the cultural resilience of her city reflected the larger survival of Aramaic identity. Across Syria and Mesopotamia, other communities echoed this persistence. Villages continued to speak local dialects, and rural shrines preserved older traditions. Palmyra's monuments may have crumbled, but the words carved on their stones remained legible, carrying forward the heritage of the Arameans in the Roman world. The story of Palmyra and Zenobia is often told as a tale of defiance against empire, but it also illuminates the endurance of culture beneath shifting politics. Rome conquered, Persians invaded, cities rose and fell, yet the language of the Arameans remained on the lips of merchants, soldiers, and villagers. Palmyra's grandeur lay not only in its architecture, but in its ability to hold together Greek forms and Aramaic voices, fusing them into something distinct. When travelers today read the inscriptions left on Palmyrene tombs, they encounter that blend directly. Greek letters announcing status and wealth, Aramaic script preserving names and prayers. The revolt of Zenobia may have ended in defeat, but the heritage of her city and her people continued to resonate across the Near East, reminding us that political power is fleeting, while cultural endurance leaves marks that outlast empire. The 3rd and 4th centuries AD brought more than the rise and fall of cities. They marked the spread of a new faith across the lands where Aramaic was spoken, a faith that would redefine identities and give the old tongue new purpose. Christianity, born in Roman Judea, carried words of scripture and prayer in Greek, but in the marketplaces and villages of Syria and Mesopotamia, it took root in the familiar rhythms of Aramaic. The religion of Jesus and his followers would become the foundation on which Syriac culture flourished. The Gospels themselves preserve glimpses of this background. Jesus spoke a Galilean dialect of Aramaic. The words placed in his mouth, Talitha cum, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, show how central the language was to the earliest Christian communities. Greek translations spread his teachings across the empire, but in the towns and countryside of the Levant, villagers heard sermons in the language closest to their own. Missionaries moving north into Syria and east into Mesopotamia relied on it to make themselves understood. Edessa emerged early as a center of Christian life. This frontier city, capital of the small kingdom of Osroene, lay on the boundary between Rome and Persia. Its kings experimented with alliances, sometimes leaning toward Rome, sometimes toward Parthia, but its people spoke Aramaic. By the 2nd century AD, Christian communities were already present there, and tradition even claims that King Abgar himself corresponded with Jesus. Whatever the accuracy of that story, Edessa became a beacon of Syriac Christianity. By the 3rd century, it possessed churches, bishops, and scribes who began to translate scripture into the local tongue. The Peshitta, the Syriac version of the Bible, represents this transformation. Translators rendered Hebrew and Greek texts into a form of Aramaic that was clear and accessible to local communities. Through the Peshitta, the Bible became a book for villagers and merchants, not only for scholars trained in Greek. This translation gave Syriac its first great literary monument, demonstrating that the language could carry sacred meaning with precision and beauty. Schools developed alongside these texts. At Edessa, clerics trained in theology and exegesis taught pupils how to read scripture in Syriac. Oral tradition met written form, and students carried these lessons to other towns. From there, the faith spread into rural villages where it fused with long-standing customs. Shrines that once honored Hadad or Atargatis were repurposed for Christian worship. Springs and groves, long associated with local deities, became sites of baptism and prayer. The new religion did not erase memory, it reshaped it. Martyrs' stories reinforced this spread. In the persecutions of the 3rd century, Christians in Syria and Mesopotamia were executed for refusing to honor the gods of Rome. Their tales circulated in Syriac, read aloud in gatherings, strengthening identity. The language gave voice to both suffering and hope, binding communities more closely together. Even after Constantine legalized Christianity in 313 AD, the memory of these martyrs in Syriac writing shaped the piety of the faithful. Edessa was not alone. Nisibis, further east, became another stronghold. Its schools trained clerics who would later influence the great theological debates of the Christian world. Scribes there copied biblical manuscripts in Syriac, ensuring consistency across congregations. From Nisibis, missionaries traveled further east, carrying the faith into Persia and beyond. In each case, they spoke and wrote in the language that local villagers already understood. The Roman state gradually embraced Christianity, but in the Aramaic-speaking lands, the faith had already sunk deep roots. Councils and bishops debated doctrine in Greek, yet their congregations listened to homilies in Syriac. Hymns composed in the local tongue filled churches with melody, their lines memorized by men and women who could not read but who repeated the words in prayer. Christianity in the East was not a foreign import. It grew through the language of the people themselves. This process also reshaped identity. The older term, Aramean, faded in everyday use, replaced by Syrian or Syriac as the Christian communities defined themselves. To call oneself Syriac no longer meant only to speak a dialect of Aramaic. It meant to belong to a religious community with its own scripture, liturgy, and teachers. Language and faith fused to create a new cultural identity, one that survived even when political control shifted between Rome and Persia. The 4th century saw the flourishing of Syriac literature beyond scripture. Hymnists, most famously Ephraim the Syrian, composed poetry that explored theology through vivid imagery drawn from daily life. His works compared divine truth to streams, gardens, and light, images familiar to villagers and city dwellers alike. Syriac proved not only functional, but capable of expressing profound thought in poetic form. In doing so, it elevated the language from a tool of commerce to a medium of high culture. Church building followed the spread of communities. In villages where once stood small shrines, churches of stone rose with apses and altars. Baptismal fonts replaced sacred springs, but the sound of prayer remained in the same cadences. Inscriptions carved into church lintels and tombs appear in Syriac, recording names and dedications. Archaeology reveals crosses etched beside older motifs, showing how faith layered itself onto tradition. Conflict with Persia heightened the role of Syriac identity. Along the frontier, Christian communities often faced suspicion from Persian rulers who associated Christianity with Rome. Persecutions under Shapur II in the 4th century created new martyrs whose acts were recorded in Syriac and circulated widely. These stories emphasized loyalty to faith over politics, strengthening the cohesion of communities under pressure. Language again served as the vessel of resilience. By the close of the 4th century, Christianity had remade the landscape of the Aramaic-speaking world. The Peshitta provided scripture, the hymns of Ephraim inspired devotion, and schools trained generations of clerics. Villages identified themselves not only by their dialects, but by their Syriac churches. The transition from Aramean to Syriac was complete. A people once defined by tribal kingdoms and language had become a religious and cultural community with its own enduring institutions. The Christianization of the Arameans did not mean the disappearance of their past. Memories of ancient kingdoms lingered in genealogies and place names, and older customs still shaped local festivals. But the new faith gave them a framework that transcended local loyalties, linking them to the wider Christian world while preserving their own voice. Syriac Christianity stood as both local and universal, rooted in the Near East yet reaching far beyond. The 4th through 7th centuries AD witnessed the flowering of Syriac culture, a period often described as its golden age. In this era, the Aramaic tongue, now firmly shaped into its Syriac form, carried theology, poetry, and philosophy across the Near East. What had begun as the speech of villagers and merchants became a vehicle for high literature and a bridge between civilizations. Edessa led the way. Its schools produced generations of teachers, theologians, and translators who worked to establish Syriac as a literary language equal to Greek or Latin. The city's Christian rulers patronized learning, and bishops encouraged the training of students in both scripture and rhetoric. Here, the Peshitta was copied and disseminated, ensuring a common version of the Bible across Syriac-speaking lands. Alongside scripture, new genres of writing appeared: homilies, commentaries, hymns, that gave form to a distinct intellectual tradition. Among the most influential voices was Ephraim the Syrian, who lived in the 4th century. A deacon of Nisibis and later Edessa, he composed hundreds of hymns in Syriac, weaving theological arguments into verses meant to be sung by congregations. His imagery drew on rivers, vineyards, and the play of light, making doctrine vivid for audiences who might never read a treatise. Ephraim's work spread quickly, and his reputation as a teacher and poet earned him respect far beyond his homeland. Even in later centuries, his hymns were translated into Greek and Latin, testifying to the reach of Syriac creativity. Nisibis rivaled Edessa as a center of learning. After the city fell to Persia in 363 AD, its scholars relocated and re-established their school under Roman protection. There, students were trained not only in scripture, but in philosophy and medicine. Syriac became a medium for transmitting knowledge across borders, as teachers translated Greek works into the local tongue and used them in their classrooms. From Nisibis, missionaries carried learning eastward, bringing Syriac texts into Persia and eventually Central Asia. Translation was central to this golden age. Greek philosophy and science found their way into Syriac, and through Syriac into Arabic centuries later. Works of Aristotle, Galen, and other classical authors were rendered into Syriac by bilingual scholars. These translations preserved knowledge that might otherwise have been lost during times of political upheaval. They also shaped the development of Syriac prose, expanding its vocabulary and demonstrating its capacity to handle complex concepts. The rise of monasticism deepened this cultural flowering. Monks settled in deserts and mountains, devoting themselves to prayer, study, copying texts. Their monasteries became centers of literacy, where manuscripts were preserved and new works produced. Syriac literature from this era includes not only theology, but also histories, biographies of saints, and collections of wisdom sayings. Monastic scribes ensured that these texts circulated widely, binding communities across vast distances with a shared literary heritage. Syriac also became the language of diplomacy and correspondence in regions where Greek or Latin held less sway. Bishops wrote letters to distant communities. Missionaries carried texts to Persia, and debates with Zoroastrian or Jewish leaders were recorded in Syriac. Its adaptability allowed it to function both as the voice of local congregations and as a tool for engaging with rival traditions. The diversity of thought expressed in Syriac reflects the richness of this age. Writers debated the nature of Christ, the relationship of the divine and human, and the meaning of Scripture. Controversies that divided the wider Christian world, Nestorian, Monophysite, Chalcedonian disputes, were all argued in Syriac as well as Greek. Far from being passive recipients of doctrine, Syriac authors shaped theological discourse through their own interpretations and contributions. Art and architecture accompanied this literary expansion. Churches built in Syria and Mesopotamia often carried inscriptions in Syriac, recording dedications and prayers. Carved stone crosses, illuminated manuscripts, and wall paintings bore the mark of a culture confident in its identity. Pilgrims who traveled to Jerusalem or other holy sites left graffiti in Syriac alongside Greek and Latin, evidence that their language was part of the broader Christian world. Education broadened as well. Children in Syriac-speaking towns learned letters in church schools, where reading Scripture was the primary goal. From there, the most gifted advanced to study under renowned teachers. The spread of literacy beyond elite circles meant that Syriac was not confined to the educated few. Hymns, prayers, and proverbs in the local tongue reached congregations across social classes, creating a sense of shared belonging. The Golden Age also saw Syriac literature extend beyond the Near East. Missionaries traveled along trade routes into Persia, India, and even China, carrying manuscripts with them. In distant lands, Syriac inscriptions appear on stone stelae, testifying to communities far from their homeland. This global reach was remarkable. A language that had begun among tribal wanderers of the Syrian steppe now left its mark on temples in Asia. Yet the heart of Syriac culture remained the schools and monasteries of Mesopotamia and Syria. Teachers lectured on Scripture, monks copied texts, and poets composed hymns that shaped the faith of ordinary believers. In this period, Syriac achieved what few languages of the ancient Near East had managed. It bridged the world of empire and the world of the village, the learned and the ordinary, the local and the universal. By the early 7th century, the Near East stood on the edge of great change. New powers were rising in Arabia, and centuries of Byzantine and Persian rivalry had exhausted the region. Syriac culture had already given the world its hymns, translations, and schools. It had preserved the memory of the Arameans while transforming that heritage into something new. In the centuries to come, its scholars would play a crucial role in passing classical knowledge into Arabic, and through Arabic into Latin Europe. The Golden Age was not an isolated moment. It was a foundation for future exchanges. When Arab tribes burst out of the Arabian Peninsula in the early 7th century AD, they found a Near East fractured by decades of Byzantine-Persian conflict. The great empires had drained their strength in wars over Mesopotamia and Syria, leaving cities vulnerable and countryside populations weary of heavy taxation. Into this vacuum, the armies of Islam advanced, carrying with them not only a new faith, but also a new political order. For the descendants of the Arameans, who by now identified largely as Syriac-speaking Christians, this transition marked another transformation in their long history. The first conquests came swiftly. In 636 AD, Arab forces defeated the Byzantines at Yarmouk, securing Syria. Within a few years, Damascus fell, and by 637, the Persians had lost Ctesiphon. Mesopotamia, homeland to many Syriac-speaking communities, was absorbed into the new caliphate. For the villagers along the Euphrates and the Tigris, the change in rulers did not immediately alter daily routines. Fields still had to be sown, canals dredged, and markets supplied. But the shift in power brought long-term consequences for language, faith, and identity. Administratively, The early caliphs initially relied on existing systems. In Syria, Greek continued in government offices. In Mesopotamia, Persian scribes kept records. Yet in both regions, Syriac functioned as the practical bridge between local communities and their new rulers. Tax registers, contracts, and village accounts were often handled in the language people knew best. Christian clerics and laymen, who had long served as scribes under Byzantines, and Persians now found themselves equally useful under Arab governors. Religious life changed more dramatically. Islam introduced new beliefs and practices, but in its first century, the Caliphate allowed Christians and Jews to continue their faith as people of the book. Syriac-speaking Christians paid special taxes, but were permitted to maintain their churches, monasteries, and schools. In some cases, Christian leaders welcomed the change, preferring Arab rule to the heavy hand of Byzantium, which had often persecuted those whose theology diverged from Constantinople. For communities divided by disputes over Christ's nature, the relative tolerance of the Caliphate provided space to breathe. Damascus, chosen as the capital of the Umayyad Caliphate in 661 AD, became a focal point for this new order. Its streets filled with Arabic, but Syriac and Greek could still be heard in markets and offices. The Great Mosque of Damascus, built on the site of an earlier Christian church, symbolized the new faith's ascendancy. Yet nearby monasteries continued to copy scripture in Syriac, and pilgrims still chanted hymns in the language of their ancestors. Monasteries in Mesopotamia likewise endured. Places like Tur Abdin in the mountains of modern southeastern Turkey became bastions of Syriac Christianity. Monks prayed in their chapels, tended vineyards, and preserved manuscripts. Their scriptoria copied not only scripture and hymns, but also works of philosophy and medicine translated from Greek into Syriac. Under Arab rule, these communities became vital transmitters of knowledge, translating texts again into Arabic for the benefit of the new rulers. This role as translators proved decisive. The Abbasid Caliphate, established in 750 AD with its capital in Baghdad, invested heavily in scholarship. The caliphs sought Greek science, philosophy, and medicine, and they turned to Syriac-speaking Christians to provide it. Scholars from Edessa, Nisibis, and Gundashapur translated Aristotle, Galen, and other classical authors first into Syriac, then into Arabic. Their work laid the foundation for the flowering of Islamic intellectual life. In this way, Syriac Christians became indispensable to the cultural achievements of their conquerors. Education in Syriac flourished alongside this translation movement. Schools trained new generations of clerics who could read scripture and teach doctrine, but they also equipped students with the skills to serve in the caliphate's bureaucracy. Knowledge of Syriac and Greek allowed them to access a wide range of texts, while their fluency in Arabic ensured their usefulness at court. Out of this trilingual world emerged a culture that was both deeply rooted in its Aramean heritage and fully engaged with the wider Islamic empire. Language, however, slowly shifted. Arabic, the tongue of the conquerors and of the Quran, spread steadily through administration, trade, and education. By the 9th century, it was replacing Greek and Persian in government offices. Syriac remained strong in churches, monasteries, and rural villages, but in urban centers, Arabic gained ground. Sermons were still preached in Syriac, but younger generations in cities increasingly spoke Arabic in markets and homes. The transition was gradual, not abrupt, but over time it reshaped the identity of Syriac-speaking peoples. Despite this, Syriac culture reached remarkable heights under early Islam. Writers composed theological treatises, saints' lives, and histories in the local tongue. Hymnographers continued the tradition, begun by Ufrem, filling churches with poetry that celebrated both faith and identity. Chronicles recorded the passage of empires, often from a perspective distinct from the Byzantine or Arab accounts. In their pages, the memory of Aramean ancestry lingered, reframed within Christian faith and Syriac culture. Villages remained strongholds of continuity. In places like Malula, perched in the mountains north of Damascus, Aramaic dialects survived in daily speech. Families prayed in Syriac, worked their fields, and passed on stories in the same language that had shaped their ancestors' lives. These enclaves, isolated yet persistent, embodied the resilience of a heritage that adapted without surrendering entirely. Architecture also bore witness to this persistence. Churches from the early Islamic centuries often reused older stones but carved inscriptions in Syriac, recording dedications and prayers. Monastic complexes expanded, their walls rising beside Muslim towns. Coexistence defined the landscape. Mosques called the faithful to prayer, while bells rang from nearby monasteries. Conflict occurred at times, but so too did cooperation, as communities shared markets, water, and labor. By the 10th century, Syriac Christians were a recognized minority within the Islamic world, respected for their scholarship, even as they lived under restrictions. They occupied a paradoxical position, politically subordinate yet culturally influential. Their translations carried ancient knowledge into Arabic, and through Arabic into Latin centuries later. Their liturgy and hymns nourished congregations across Syria, Mesopotamia, and beyond. Their schools trained not only clerics, but also physicians and philosophers who served in Muslim courts. This transformation of the Aramaeans under Islam was profound. They no longer ruled cities or kingdoms, and many gradually adopted Arabic as their spoken language. Yet their identity did not disappear. It endured in churches, in monasteries, in manuscripts written in elegant Syriac script, and in the persistence of dialects in remote villages. What had begun in the steppe centuries earlier as the speech of nomads had become the spiritual and intellectual inheritance of a Christian minority living under Islam. The arrival of Arab conquerors might have marked another chapter of loss for a people long accustomed to subjugation by greater powers. Instead, it opened a new role, guardians of learning and mediators of cultures. Syriac Christians stood at the crossroads of civilizations, preserving the wisdom of the past and transmitting it to the future. In that role, the legacy of the Arameans found yet another way to endure. The long journey of the Arameans, from desert wanderers of the late Bronze Age to Christian communities under Islamic rule, did not end with political power or territorial control. By the 7th century AD, their kingdoms had vanished, their aristocracies were gone, and Arabic was gradually replacing their speech in many cities. Yet they endured in a form more resilient than states or armies. As Syriacs, a people defined by language, literature, and faith, their story became less about ruling empires and more about carrying a legacy through centuries of upheaval. In the mountains of Tur Abdin, communities gathered around monasteries that preserved both faith and language. Stone churches rose above terraced fields, their walls inscribed in Syriac script. Monks copied manuscripts, chanted hymns, and taught the next generation to read and write. These monasteries were more than religious centers. They were repositories of memory, ensuring that the words of the Arameans did not vanish. Families in nearby villages continued to speak. Dialects descended from ancient Aramaic, maintaining ties that linked them to the oldest layers of Near Eastern history. Malula, perched in the mountains of Syria, became another stronghold of continuity. its inhabitants preserved a form of Western Aramaic spoken nowhere else. Pilgrims who visited its churches in later centuries heard prayers and songs in a language close to that spoken by Jesus himself. Isolated by geography, yet sustained by devotion, Malula survived as a living reminder of the depth of Aramean heritage. Even as Arabic dominated the region, the village kept alive the cadences of an older world. Further east, in Mesopotamia, Syriac-speaking communities clustered along the Tigris and Euphrates. Churches and schools in cities like Mosul, Arbela, and Seleucia produced manuscripts and trained clergy. Here, Syriac Christians played a crucial role in the Abbasid Golden Age, translating Greek philosophy and science into Arabic. Their scholars bridged civilizations, ensuring that works of Aristotle, Plato, and Galen survived the fall of the classical world and entered the intellectual life of Islam and later medieval Europe. This role gave Syriac communities influence far beyond their numbers. The liturgy of Syriac Christianity anchored identity. Hymns, prayers, and scripture in Syriac gave believers a sense of belonging, distinct from both their Muslim rulers and their Greek-speaking Christian neighbors. Services conducted in Syriac reinforced a communal bond, reminding villagers and townsfolk alike that they were heirs to a tradition older than Rome and Byzantium. The cadence of these prayers, repeated generation after generation, carried forward the voices of the ancient Arameans into a new age. Manuscripts became treasures of continuity. Copied in elegant Estrangelo script, they preserved not only scripture, but also homilies, theological treatises, histories, and poetry. Each manuscript was a labor of devotion, produced in monasteries where scribes worked by lamplight. Marginal notes often record the names of patrons, families who commissioned a text for their village church, or the circumstances of copying, such as famine, war, or plague. Through these manuscripts, we glimpse not only the resilience of Syriac culture, but also the lived experiences of communities that refused to let their heritage die. Pilgrimage routes reinforced this identity across distances. Travelers journeyed from one monastery to another, carrying news, manuscripts, and songs. Pilgrims from Tur Abdin might meet those from Mesopotamia or Palestine, and together they shared liturgies that bound far-flung communities into a single cultural sphere. Syriac Christianity thus operated as a network of memory, linking scattered villages into a wider people who understood themselves as heirs of the Arameans. Over the centuries, challenges mounted. Waves of conquest, from Mongols in the 13th century to Ottoman campaigns in the 16th, tested the endurance of these communities. Persecution, massacre, and forced migration repeatedly thinned their numbers. Yet in each period, enclaves survived, often in the same mountainous refuges that had sheltered them before. Language shifted in many regions toward Arabic, Kurdish, or Turkish, but Syriac remained in liturgy and in the hearts of those who claimed it as their inheritance. Identity evolved in response to these pressures. By the medieval period, the word Syriac described not only a language, but a community of churches. Syriac Orthodox, Church of the East, Maronites, and others. Each maintained distinctive traditions, yet shared the common heritage of Aramaic speech and script. Through them, the legacy of the Arameans found continuity, reshaped to meet new realities, but never lost. Diaspora added another layer. Beginning in late antiquity and intensifying in modern times, Syriac-speaking Christians established communities beyond the Near East. Migrants carried their language and traditions to Europe, the Americas, and Australia. Churches abroad still conducted services in Syriac, connecting new generations to their ancestral past. In liturgy and song, the voices of ancient Arameans could still be heard in cities far from Mesopotamia or Syria. Archaeology and scholarship have helped to rediscover this story. Inscriptions from Palmyra, graffiti from Dura Europos, manuscripts from Edessa and Nisibis all provide glimpses into the endurance of a people without a kingdom. Each discovery affirms that the Arameans did not vanish, but transformed, leaving a cultural imprint more enduring than political boundaries. Modern Syriac communities can trace their heritage across millennia through these records. The survival of Aramaic dialects into the present underscores this persistence. In Turabdin, Malula, and villages of northern Iraq, people still speak forms of the ancient language. Though endangered, these dialects carry echoes of the speech once heard in the courts of Damascus and the markets of Babylon. Linguists and cultural advocates record and teach them, striving to ensure they endure into the future. Each spoken phrase is a living link to the distant past. Thus, the story of the Arameans closes not with disappearance, but with transformation. They began as nomadic tribes in the Syrian steppe, forged kingdoms that contended with Assyria and Israel, endured conquest and exile, and reshaped themselves as Syriac Christians under Rome, Byzantium, and Islam. Their dynasties fell, their armies scattered, their cities captured, but their language and faith persisted, weaving them into the fabric of world history. Today, Syriac communities still gather in churches, adorned with inscriptions in the script of their ancestors. They chant hymns composed in the 4th century, read scripture in the Peshitta, and preserve dialects that trace back to the 1st millennium BC. Their numbers may be fewer, but their presence testifies to endurance beyond empire. The Arameans, reborn as Syriacs, remind us that cultural identity often outlasts political power. The journey from tents on the Syrian steppe to global diaspora has been long, marked by suffering and resilience alike. What endures is a thread that connects past to present. The words once spoken by wandering tribes, reshaped into a language of scripture and song, carried through conquest and exile, and still alive today. That thread ensures that the story of the Arameans is not merely ancient history, but a living legacy woven into the voices of those who call themselves Syriac.